The panel discussion we're about to have now is almost why we have events like this, so it's no surprise to see the room full. We're discussing global supply chain interruptions. What else? Our two panelists will be, first up, Ben Godfrey, the VP of Procurement from Rolls-Royce. You can grab a seat there. And joining him on stage, Ashley Norton, Director of Supply Chain from Capgemini. So I think we'll just start with introductions. Go one by one. Ben, then Ashley. Tell us about yourself, your career today, and what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. So Ben Godfrey, Rolls-Royce, as was said. I've been at Rolls-Royce for coming up to 18 years, which is an incredibly long time. Always worked in procurement and supply chain. Had a brief period in kind of operations, manufacturing, but always in procurement and mainly in metal, which maybe there's some interest in the room today.
Excellent. Ashley.
So I started off at Rolls-Royce, coincidentally, 18 years as well before I left. So all in supply chain, operations and logistics. Number of years in the US as well. I moved out of aerospace and went into automotive, supporting some of the larger OEMs in the UK, all around supply chain operations, and just in time kind of manufacturing, methodology. I also went into some logistics operations in automotive for a brief period, and then about 4 years ago I kind of transitioned into supply chain consultancy. So that's my history.
Excellent. Well, let's get straight into it. And I want to start with the Suez Canal. What does the Ever Given tell us about risk and resiliency? Whoever you want, just jump in.
I'm smiling because I've just got that picture, if anyone can remember it, of the tiny digger. And you realise, being a supply chain professional, how little you know sometimes about what actually is going on in your supply chain. And that image really stuck with me. You know, that one guy in the digger was basically, we were all dependent on him figuring out how to get all our parts moving again. And it was the realisation, and I guess the remembering that you've got to have that humility to know that you don't know everything.
Well, humility, when we spoke before, Ashley, being humble. I think that was one of the first things that you said.
Yeah, I think for me that the humility comes into understanding how complex the supply chains really are, that we as consumers naturally just expect things to turn up when we want them at the right price, and we don't really understand that complexity. And unfortunately, it takes events like, the Suez Canal to really demonstrate to all of us how fragile it is, and actually how long those impacts really affect us all on a day-to-day basis. And if we can understand it a little bit better than what we do today, we can actually start to accept that maybe some of the things that we take for granted, like the vast variation of products and services that we all expect, we might just need to change our expectations a little. An example would have been, particularly as we went through the early phases of COVID, lots of the products on the shelves in supermarkets suddenly disappeared. That was because of complexity in terms of having an abundance of choice. And I think that humility might just be around accepting a little bit less complexity and choice might be a way forward to drive more resiliency.
There's almost two elements there, though, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit, but there's simplifying something that's complex, and then there's simplifying the complexity itself. Technology appears to do the latter, and then what the former is is that visibility? Is that how we do it?
I think is it visibility? I think visibility always helps. It's a key topic. The more you can see, the more you can measure, the more you can take action. You also, to Ashley's point, perhaps have to understand there are things that you will never see, and you have to accept that and acknowledge it, and maybe start to build more contingency into your supply chain and your sourcing. So I'm driven very hard for cost reduction as one of my objectives. There are times where I've over-prioritised cost reduction and learnt the lesson versus building some extra contingency in and saying I'm never going to get visibility of everything. So the way I'm going to manage this situation is to give myself some contingency rather than the very best optimised cost solution. as an example.
Yeah. Well, what does it mean? Now let's move to COVID, right? Then it's not about cost reduction so much as it is about actually having a function to perform and being able to perform it. What happens when the rule book gets thrown out the window?
Then you need a new rule book, quite frankly. What it requires is a focus on the things that really, really matter. And I think a phrase that I've used a few times in the last year to 18 months is supply chains matter. And I don't think they did too much before. We've heard numerous speakers today talk about supply chain sitting in the background, not really being on the kind of the CEO's agenda. Now it's at the forefront. So I think things have changed. That rule book has changed because of the emphasis and the importance that supply chains affects every single one of us on a day-to-day basis, where as before I don't think it was acknowledged. So.
I think it's a great point. I'd add to that a slightly different perspective. You mentioned COVID. I can still remember, and probably everybody else can, the Prime Minister of the country standing on the TV, work from home. And in that moment of what really matters, it wasn't actually supply chains or even work. It was that first grief curve of, is there a killer virus out there and are the kids going to be okay? And yes, they were, of course, but it's quite an extreme example. But actually what you then got to work-wise, actually all of the things that I thought mattered, whether they were the rituals of being in the office and doing the work, or actually a number of the things I was focusing on as priority, none of them did, because we very quickly, as you said, the rule book had gone. We've got a small group of people that have got a lot of things still to deliver. How do we do that? And we had to ask that question repeatedly. How are we going to do this? What would it take for us to reach the solution we need? And we had to completely rewire the rule book, rewire our processes. What data have we got? What are we prepared to just live with? Versus what do we actually need to win the argument on?
Well, that's... Oh, go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, I think just building on the point that Ben was making here, I think a great example of that would also be, we saw a lot of manufacturing companies that were using capacity to actually start to produce PPE equipment that had nothing to do with their industry. So they were using that availability of capacity to do something really, really good. That's an extension of supply chain. And for me, that really epitomised and emphasised the importance of how supply chains can react in an agile way and make a real difference to every single one of us.
No, this is where we get into the territory of, are interruptions always a bad thing? Because we had in previous talks on this stage, people saying, well, I would have asked for a 7-figure investment and I'll get it signed off immediately now. Had I asked 2 years ago, no chance. So are they always a bad thing?
Do you want to take that one, Ben?
They often feel bad, don't they? I guess, really in your face. There's a lot of things that are around us right now that are happening in quick succession and they feel bad. You've got customers to support, you've got things to do and deliver. But if you step back from that, there's the necessity drives invention kind of view of the world. So you've talked about being able to do things that wouldn't have been possible before. My experience has been in the last couple of years, we've done some things really fundamentally different and produced some outsized results in the work we've done because we've had to do it differently. So that interruption allows you to do it. You can think about, everybody that's thinking about buying a car or leasing a car, you'll have that consideration of, do you go electric? You wouldn't have perhaps thought that, or maybe only a few enlightened people would have thought that 5 years ago. Oil prices continue to go up, your investment case changes. So those interruptions, those things you weren't expecting, actually out of them can come the very best solutions and ideas that can really move us forward.
Well, I think impetus to change is kind of crucial. So 2 things rose, right? Supply chain, or rather, supply chain and sustainability. So now the 2 are pretty much getting married together. I just wonder, in both of your individual journeys over the past 2 years, if you have any examples, for instances of when you literally saw this happening in real time, that you can share.
I think there's a few examples where supply chain and sustainability have started to emerge together. I think for me, supply chain, I'd put the functional profession to one side and I'd bring in the relationship between resiliency and sustainability. I think as we went through the pandemic, and actually before the pandemic, we had issues around how do you mitigate to some of the challenges around Brexit and the costs and the delays. Resiliency came up a lot, and as we went through COVID, resiliency kept coming up, and I've never actually heard resiliency used so much as we were actually coming through COVID and figuring out how we wanted to manage this thing. Sustainability is now coming really, really strong. It's been around for a while, let's be honest, but it's really now at the forefront. And for me, I think you need to consider resilience and sustainability together. And that's where I think there's less real case study and example. There's a lot being done, but I think this is an area where we're going to see a lot more in the coming kind of months and years.
When we look at the supply chain now, we talk about future-proofing it. What's that going to look like? And what does it look like for yourselves personally?
I mean, I come back to your last question a little, actually. So my day job is buying metal for Rolls-Royce, which is interesting, very interesting. My second day job, which I'm complete volunteer and enthusiastic amateur, is I lead our sustainability efforts. The coming together of those two things, if you think about electrification, that requires metal. You talk about future-proofing your supply chain, you've got to go all the way through from your base materials in the manufacturing environment all the way through to the customers. And you need to have some understanding of that, and you actually need to start wiring in and building in that resilience you were talking about, perhaps, Ashley. And I think that comes from long-term balanced relationships all the way through your supply chain. But if you take that example of metal supply, you've got some crazy supply and demand factors out there right now. For people that make things out of metal, and for anybody that wants to electrify anything, that's something you need to be hugely focused on.
Fantastic.
It's a great point there. It's a really complex challenge, this. It's not easy, let's be honest. Lots of people will talk about creating resiliency, mapping the value chain, but the question really is, how do you do it? Because it's really, really tough, right? Supply chains are really difficult to manage, particularly when you get into some of the sectors, the more complex sectors like Ben works in aerospace, where you've got massively complex bill of materials and bill of processes. It's bloody difficult, right? So it's about intelligent segmentation. It's about choosing what you invest in, mapping those, investing in those, and then developing those insights through that rich data stream that's available into a meaningful action plan.
So do you think resegmentation, in a way, is kind of the order of the day? I mean, now that effectively you have to digitize, modernize everything, transform it, make it visible, and then pull the data from it so you can know what's going on. Do you, as part of that process, have to evaluate how we've segmented all these tasks anyway?
I think, yes, you do.
Yeah.
You have to segment, and you have to make intelligent decisions around the data. We've heard about a data abundance or overload of data. It's about intelligent selecting data sources, about aggregation, about picking the right use cases in line with the strategy, about redefining the measurements of the business so that you bring in together not only the cost efficiency, but actually the value that the supply chain can deliver. It's looking at it slightly differently, and I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're getting close to it, I think.
And I think you've got a short-term and a long-term side of the coin in that discussion. The urgency on supply chains is increasing. I think a number of people would recognise and understand that. I don't think that's going to change and slow down in any way. But the time to start the kind of initiatives that Ashley's talking about, that takes some time. You've got to understand your landscape, your own supply chain, your partners. Many companies can't do the digital journey on their own. And actually the time to start that was yesterday, because you need it now. But the next best time to start it is now. And you've got to recognise it's going to take you some time to get to that better future state that you're aiming for.
I mean, there is an important point that I just wanted to jump in. We hear about net zero, we hear about scope 3. Well, you have to start to connect the dots to understand. That means understanding the value chain of a segment, and then you have to look at the categories of scope 3. So you have to decide as a business what it is that you want to do, and then decide who's going to help you on that journey, because you can't do it alone. We've heard about collaboration, being important between suppliers, the ecosystem. You have to collaborate with partners to enable you to deliver this improvement, this journey. It's so difficult. You have to.
I have a couple more lines to go on change, people and technology, but it's a very full room. Do people want to, if we can start the Q&A early, I will. Is anybody ready to ask something? Already, excellent. Can we get a microphone up to, is it Jack? Yeah, Kieran's just bringing you the microphone there. I started it early, so it wasn't in position, which is fine.
You've caught them off guard, haven't you?
Yeah, I know, not really fair. Jack, the gentleman at the end of the second row.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Chandra Vasudev from Cusentus Technologies. My question relates to the cost of creating spare capacity and resilience within the supply chain. Do you think there is an additional cost to the company? And if so, who will pay for it? The company, the customer, supplier, competitors? What do you think?
The question was about, is there an additional cost for building that capacity and resilience? Yes, there is. Of course there is. And ultimately, in the short term, that's an interaction between supplier and customer, and whatever the power dynamic is, I guess that's who pays. But in the long term, supply chains as entities will need to bear that cost, perhaps if they're to thrive and to survive. In our industry, Ashley mentioned, hugely complex, but some very specialist suppliers. We win the argument, they don't make any money, suddenly we're not getting any parts. Your kind of debate on resiliency has disappeared completely. So ultimately, as an industry, I think we're going to have to figure out how to share some of that burden between us.
Well, that seems to would also be part of supply chain, part of the service, would be if we're able to cover that, or at least be at the forefront, you're solving problems before they happen. Anybody else?
Well, so I was just going to add on to that point for the gentleman here. Capacity is not free, okay? But there are ways to mitigate the cost of that capacity by reducing some of the complexity that we ask for. So you can be more efficient in the type of capacity that you source. For me as well, it's also about trying to look at the value in which that capacity can bring. That value can be delivered in terms of a higher level of resiliency and assurance of availability of goods. We've all seen the impact, the positive impact of having medical equipment and PPE available to us. We would all value that. So it becomes more of a value discussion rather than a cost discussion. It's part of it, yes. So there's a balance that we all need to start understanding.
Technology and people, which one should be leading how this change is managed?
I think it's about people, process and technology. You can't necessarily say one is more important than the other. You need all three, okay? Perhaps this event so far, we've focused quite a lot on the technology side of things. A little bit's been discussed about change management, but I think that's a big area that has to be focused on and invested in. If we're going to engage the value chain, once we understand what that value chain looks like, if we're going to engage it, we have to look at the issues around commercial competitiveness, about IP, intellectual property, about, I guess, nervousness of sharing data that might then be shared in collaboration platforms. All of those things have to be considered, otherwise technology just won't get you there.
Yeah, I think I'd make an argument just to, I guess, make the argument, so it's a bit of a straw man here. I think you have to start with people. I think change is a people sport. It's only ever people that change things. Technology is huge leverage. Historically, you can leverage things through more people, resources. You can leverage through capital. I think technology and code now allows you to leverage ideas on a scale you've never been able to do before. You can reach anybody in the world effectively. So the challenge is then connecting those dots in an effective and efficient way for your enterprise. And right now, I think you've got a huge competing infrastructure. And you know, as a producer, as a manufacturer, it's quite challenging to pick, well, who are those perhaps digital and technology providers that are going to be here for the long haul? What's the future standard going to be? There's a huge number of competing infrastructures. They're not all going to be successful. The last thing I want to do as a manufacturing guy is back a horse and in 3 years' time have to completely come out of that and rewire my approach. So there's, I think, a little bit of nervousness for people to jump in with both feet, because actually, are you sure where the standard's going to be in 5 years' time?
Well, speaking of moving forward 5 years at a time versus 2, we have a question coming in online. Has COVID accelerated your sustainability journey? It's difficult.
Do you want to answer from
I will.
Rol's perspective? And
I think it is certainly upped the level of focus. I mean, we fundamentally believe that there is an energy transition, you know, in front of us. We think that brings huge opportunity with a number of challenges, clearly. So our focus is massively uplifted, but it's also fair to say that, you know, like many businesses, we've had a very challenging time, and the last couple of years has largely been about survival. So I think the focus has increased. Has it made us go any faster? Perhaps not yet.
Being in a consultant's role, I work with different businesses across different sectors. You know, at Capgemini, we truly do promote and work to a sustainability by default. We try and take that into all of our discussions with our clients. We actually measure our own carbon footprint of our projects that we deliver right now. So we try and walk the walk. I think sustainability is, if not the number one topic of discussion in certain sectors right now. It's certainly catching up. So even in the manufacturing sector, where it's perhaps a little bit more challenging because of the complexity, the bills and materials, the processes, to think about how you engage about sustainability, it's certainly being asked for in proposals. As almost, it's being inferred that they want to see sustainability rather than directly. So it's definitely on the top of almost all organisations' agenda now, and I fully support what we've heard from other people today on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you know, to add to my will it make us go faster? I think it will. I think we perhaps just at the point where it's starting now to come out of that survival mode, and so actually we see opportunities out there. We know there's a lot to do. And we're open to learning from others. Actually, we are humble
Ben,
back to that.
You've been on your knees as a business, you know, because of the impact that COVID has had on travel. You're power by the hour. You know, revenues have completely fallen, you know, through the floor. So these guys have had it so hard that I think survival and conservation has been primary focus, but electrification and nuclear energy and all the things that Rolls is really invested in and promoting themselves with, they're all going to be right on the top of the agenda now. And we're seeing that all the time.
Yeah, well said.
I think that's great. I mean, that is what it comes down to. Well, it's good to see that you're here. And that's all we've got time for this session, but I'd like to really thank our panellists for sharing that.
Thank you.
Ben and Ashley will be on other stages at other times, but we will move on to our next presentation.
Thank you.